This, good morning, class. This is the lecture for Wednesday, April 22nd, on Turkey in the 21st century. Now, I said at the beginning of this class that I was told many years ago that the three countries to watch in trying to understand the modern Middle East are Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. And of the three, clearly Turkey has come out of the transition since World War II in the best position. That is obvious from its economic development, its continued economic development. I'll come back to that. But it also has remained relatively stable other than the military interventions that we saw first in 1960 and then more decisively in 1980. And so I wanted to go over some of the main developments since the 2000 in Turkey. And the most important, I think, is the economic rise of the country. It was put in place, the possibility that the economic takeoff would take place in the 21st century was put in place back after the military regime in the early 80s. And then the very dynamic prime ministership of Turgut Özal, who I spoke about in the lecture on that period, he opened Turkey up to basically the world economy. And Turkey was in a very good position to take advantage of that. It had a large, relatively well-educated working population. It has natural resources. It doesn't have oil, but it has minerals. It's a very rich country agriculturally, and also, as I mentioned earlier, it is the only country in the region which is self-sufficient in water. And so it is fairly, has been, because of those, it's been fairly lucky in that it has been able to develop, and it's been quite dramatic. I gave you the figures that in the 2002 GDP in Turkey was 10,648, and this is GDP PPP. And there are different ways of measuring gross domestic product, but the economists now are favoring what they call the GDP PPP, which I don't remember what the P stand for, but it's basically trying to figure out what your purchasing power. In fact, that's probably what the PP, purchasing power. Basically, what your standard of living is based on the world economy. So, in other words, if your currency is undervalued versus the dollar, you have a higher PPP than if it's overvalued. So, it gives you a sense of what a person in a given country, what the average person, what their standard of living monetarily is. So, Turkey went from 10,000, which was what we would call then developing still or early industrializing economies. So countries like Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Thailand, those were all considering at the beginning of 2000, those were considering economies that were on the verge of taking off in the way that South Korea and Taiwan and even China did earlier. So they were countries that were seen that were just beginning to industrialize and were projected that they would be the rising stars of the 21st century. But only one of those that they made that projection for that has come true is Turkey. And you can see that Turkey went from 10,000 to roughly 28,000. So Turkey now is considered a developed country. It's part of the G20. So the industrialized countries that meet every year, it's one of the 20. As I said, it's the 18th largest economy in the world. And the only country in Latin America that is close to it, remember I said that it had been predicted that Brazil and Mexico would be where Turkey is now. They aren't. The only country in Latin America that is Chile. There are no countries in Africa that are at that level, and country in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Thailand was way below it. So Turkey now, the GNP PPP in Turkey is roughly the same as it is in countries of Eastern Europe. It's not as high as South Korea, but it's in relatively good shape. It has taken a beating even before the coronavirus epidemic. It took a beating because of bad judgments on the part of the Turkish government in terms of loans. And so the lira, the value of the national currency, has dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. But the economy itself, until relatively recently, was doing quite well, which is the reason why the other thing we have to look at is the fact that the religious conservatives have come to the fore in Turkish political life. And most commentators feel that that is a direct result of Turkey's prosperity, that Turkey in 1990, the pockets of prosperity were confined largely to the large cities. Istanbul, the commercial capital, Ankara, the actual capital, Izmir, the big port on the Aegean, and then Adana, which is an agricultural center in the south, both tobacco and cotton. And so the rest of the country really was at a pretty low level, and you could see that by driving through Turkey, that the cities look like Europe. Some of the villages along the Aegean look like Greece or Italy, but as you moved inland, it was much rougher, and the standard of living was clearly much lower in the interior towns. Well, that all changed with this economic boom, partly because Turkey, the manufacturing moved away from the large cities. So centers that had been provincial centers that had been relatively sleepy became industrial towns. Bursa was one of the worst ones, in my opinion, because Bursa was a beautiful city. It's now called Turkey's Detroit because it's where most of the cars in Turkey are made, so it's become very polluted, whereas it used to be this very beautiful city on the side of a mountain overlooking the sea, famous for its peaches. Now it's famous for its smog. But it did mean a rise of standard of living for people that had formerly been, relatively marginally farmers, better than subsistence, because Turkey's been better than subsistence farming since at least the 1940s. But they still were a relatively low standard of living. Well, those people all of a sudden have lots of money in their pocket, and they are much more traditional. The secular population is largely the urban population, the population that's been open to the ideas of Ataturk, and in the countryside, religion still remained very strong. And so what happened is, as these people became more prosperous, and we saw this already in the 1950s, remember the rise of the Democrat Party was fueled in part by a middle class growing in outside the main cities, a provincial middle class in the smaller towns, and they wanted more religion. Well, that tendency continued, and in part it was fueled by the army. The army, in an attempt, when it was in control in the 80s, as I mentioned earlier, its biggest fear was the left. It felt that the pro-communist and the labor unions and the various other kinds of movements on the left among the Kurds, that was the biggest danger Turkey faced. And so to counterbalance that, the army made religious education mandatory in the schools. The only way your parents had to sign a letter opting you out of it, saying that you did not want to take religious instruction. And that had to be a very brave parent to do that outside the cities. In the cities, that was the norm. But in smaller towns where everybody would then talk, well, Mr. X said his son couldn't take religious education, he must be an unbeliever. So there was a lot of social pressure to have your children sign up for, or not to opt, I'm sorry, it was automatic. You had to sign up to opt out. And so if you didn't sign the letter, then your children had Islamic education every day in school. And also they opened up, I think I mentioned this to you earlier, Imam Hatip schools. These were religious schools that were run by religious organizations. They're private schools, so the army allowed for the privatization of education, and that also opened the door then for privatization of universities. And what had been really sterling national universities in Turkey that is funded by the state began to decline as the state became skimpier and skimpier. Just as it is in the United States, various states have not contributed as much as they should to their state university system. Same thing happened in Turkey. The national government cut back. And so these private universities that have been built up by multimillionaires who have been profiting from this opening up of the economy, they have been building, there's at least a dozen private universities. And there are also Islamic universities now. So there was I would say there was a retrenching of a kind of Islamic values among a population. So that's another trend that we have to look at, and I'll talk about it. That is what funded or what provided the votes for the rise of the AK party, which is the dominant party in the 20th century. And so I'll come back to the parties in a minute because I want to go over the four main points. So first is the continued economic boom in Turkey, even though there have been setbacks in the last 10 years, it's still overall the last 20 years have been a really remarkable period for Turkey economically. The rise of Islam, or the reemergence of Islam as a political movement. The third is the ongoing trouble with the Kurds. And as I'll speak in this lecture, there was a period when it looked like that was about to calm down around 2011 or so. There was negotiations between Öcalan and the Prime Minister Erdoğan, and I'll come back to that. But it flared up again, especially since the Arab Spring. The trouble in southeastern Turkey has been there has been a resurgence of trouble with the PKK in southern Turkey. So that's third, the unsettled Kurdish, and the fourth then is the increasing power in the presidency. And the president of Turkey today is Recep Erdoğan, so his name is on the list there. Turkish is phonetic, but it has some letters that look odd to Americans, and one of them is the letter in his name. So a lot of people want to call him Erdogan with a G, but the G has a little over the top of it, and that means that it's basically silent. So it's Erdoğan. And then the C in his first name, Recep, is pronounced like a ch, j rather. I'm sorry, Recep Tayyib Erdoğan. So that party has increasingly taken over. So let's go back to the beginning and go back to when the party comes in, and what the new constitution had done in the Army Constitution in the 1980s. It had said that in order to have representation in Parliament, a political party had to have 10% of the vote nationally. So in Turkey, people are elected by their province, the same way we do in the United States. In the provinces, there's no equivalent of Senate, so there's only one. So let's just say there's a House of Representatives. They call it the Parliament. In the Parliament, they are by population, so that every province at least has one delegate, but then they're by, if you have a lot of people like Istanbul, then you have lots of delegates. So they're elected by each region elects its own members. But in order for you to get elected, your party has to have 10% of the vote nationally. That means it doesn't have to have 10% all the way across the country, but it means that if you're locally concentrated, and then I'll talk about the parties, and they are more or less locally, well, many of them, several of them are locally concentrated. If you're locally concentrated, then you have to win the overwhelming majority of that province or provinces in order to get 10% of the national vote. So you don't have to get 10% all the way across the country, but when they tally the votes, you have to have 10% of the votes cast in the country as a whole. And if you don't, let's say you're party A, and you got 90% in your province. Party B got 10%, but party B got 30% nationally, and party A didn't. They got 8% or 9%. That meant that the 90% of the votes that were cast in that province for that person would be lost. So it isn't approval voting the way that it is in Ireland. In Ireland, you rank your voters, your candidates. So if my guy number one doesn't win, then the ballot goes to my second choice. So in the Irish ballot, you actually list three people. And so if your first guy doesn't get enough votes, then it would go to the second guy. Well, in Turkey, no, it's lost. And they did that to cut down on political parties. There was the multiplicity of parties, and you had the same problem as you had in Israel. Now, in Israel, they've been talking about that, setting a bar of 5% in order to keep these, well, they're about to have another election again in Israel. So it shows you that that system is basically unstable. So Turkey, the army said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have a 10% bar. And hopefully that will just leave us with two parties. And when the army opened up to elections in the late 80s, they in fact created two parties. And one was supposed to be center right, the other was center left. And the army, that's what the army hoped. In other words, they hoped there would just be two parties, like the American model or maybe even the British model until recently, that would give stability to the country. Well, it didn't really work. Once the free press and everything else was lifted, then people started to be more radical, or more diverge, I should say, not radical, but diverge from the center. And so you have today in Turkey 4 parties that get the 10%, meet the 10% threshold. And I wanted to go through them and talk a little about each one of them. And they're listed on your sheet. There are more parties than that. When there is an election in Turkey, the ballot will often come, I think the last ballot had at least 12 different parties, including the Green Party. There is no Communist Party legal, but there is a very leftist party. My favorite is the EE Party, Everything's All Right Party. It's good. EE means good, the good party. But you have to get 10% nationally to actually get a member of parliament. So the 4 that have consistently, you have another option, and that is you can have an independent. That is, you can have someone running in your province that says he or she doesn't belong to any political party, and if he or she wins, then he or she gets to take his or her seat in the parliament. And I'll come to that in a minute, because that was the option that was used by the Kurds throughout most of the first decade of the 21st century. When Kurdish parties were banned, the Kurds would organize and let everybody know that candidate X was the Kurdish person, and that if you wanted to vote for Kurdish aspirations, then you vote for candidate X. And so there were independent, there are still some, but in the early 2000s, there were a lot of independent candidates in the parliament. So the main party then, the one that has emerged, is the one that is you can almost trace it all the way back through its leadership to the Democrat Party. So it was originally largely a rural party. It became an urban party as rural people moved in, but it is conservative. It is for undoing the Ataturk strict separation of church and state. It basically says that Turkey is a Muslim country. The majority of people in Turkey are Muslims. They're practicing Muslims. The state should not mess with it. They should recognize that religion is an important part of most Turks' lives. All right, so they have that. They're also pro-capitalist, the same way that the Democrat Party was. And so their name in Turkish is Adalet ve Kalkınma. Adalet is justice, but it's a word that has very Islamic connotations for there's another word for justice that's a pure Turkish word. Adalet is from Arabic, and so it's a concept in Islamic law that there should be justice and the state should provide justice. And in Arabic, it wouldn't have that same power because it's just the word for justice. But in Turkish, because any words that are of Arabic origin almost by definition have an Islamic resonance, because there's another word that's a Turkish word that means justice. And so the fact that they use that word, they use an Arabic word, adalet, a word of Arabic origin, says to the consciousness of the voter that this is an Islamic party. But then the second, kalkınma, that's a new Turkish word. It means development. So we're for capitalism. We're for the increased industrialization of Turkey. We're for opening up the markets. We're for government supporting the capitalism. And we're therefore against unions. And then in 2001, when they actually did quite well in the parliament, the best they ever did, They also were pro-European. Turkey had applied to be in the EU. It's been something that Turkey said it wanted. It would be following Ataturk's idea that Turkey was a part of Europe. But Europe was very resistant to it, especially Germany. And the kind of optimism that was prevalent in Turkey in the early 2000s about becoming part of Europe evaporated over time, as it was clear that the Europeans did not want Turkey as a predominantly Muslim country, and also as a large, if Turkey were to join the European Union, the only country larger in population would be Germany. Or maybe Turkey's larger than Germany by now. I don't know. They're roughly the same. So it'd be a very large population added in. And they said it was poorer, although by now it's not. I mean, there are countries like Bulgaria and Romania that are in the EU. There's negotiations with Albania and Macedonia, Northern Macedonia. And those countries are much poorer than Turkey. And so the Turks see, well, it's not obviously not poverty. It's got to be something else. And so the right has been able to say, well, it's European prejudice against Muslims, and that's why they don't want Turkey to join. Here lately, the European left has said, no, it's because Turkey is increasingly autocratic. The government is not free on a European standard. And then also the Kurdish issue. The left has always been very sympathetic in Europe to the Kurds, because largely the Kurds, well, they're sympathetic to nationalist movements, but also because the Kurdish movement is leftist, is self-avowedly Marxist. So the Marxists in Europe are very favorable toward the Kurdish, the PKK. So there's a lot of reasons why Europe would give the cold shoulder to Turkey, but it did push the AK Party away from embracing a European future for Turkey, and then to begin to think of other possibilities. All right, so we have then the AK Party in control, as I said, and throughout the first decade of the 21st century, Turkey was prospering. AK Party kept winning. The AK Party then realized that they wanted more power, and so the first movement that they did was they put up in 2007 a candidate for president. Now, I didn't put his name on the list. I should have. His name is Abdullah, and then Gül. Gül means rose in Turkish, so it's G-U-L with an umlaut over it. But you don't need to know it. Just remember that the AK Party decided to put a clearly political candidate up for president. Now, in most countries where you have a parliamentary system, the president is symbolic. It often is an elder statesman. This is the case in Germany, had been the case in Israel. It's in Ireland. It's often a literary figure, a poet. So it's someone that it's technically the head of state. I mean, he's the person who represents, or could be she, because in the case of Ireland, it often was a woman. She represents the nation officially, but the prime minister is the real person in charge. Well, in Turkey, like in other countries, the tradition was that the president would be an elder statesman, and after the army relinquished power, the president of Turkey was the general, in fact, who had headed the military junta. But he was a respected figure, and I would think probably most people in Turkey voted for him because they respected him. I mean, he was democratically elected. The president is democratically elected. But what they did in 2007 is the AK Party put up Abdullah Gül, who was the second in command. So they're putting and he's younger. He's younger than Erdoğan. In fact, if Erdoğan was to get removed, whatever reason, Gül would be the next head of the AK Party. So the army saw that as a real threat, and they basically, as they did back in 1997, they had basically forced the prime minister to resign. They put pressure on Erdoğan, but what Erdoğan did was he hit back. And this is one of the really interesting stories of Turkey. And so I thought I'd tell you it in some in some detail because it is the beginning of, in Turkish press, the discussion of the deep state. And this is something we're all quite familiar with now. President Trump used it a lot in running for president. The right in America keeps talking about the deep state, by which they mean the State Department and professional people, generally universities, and everybody who wants to keep the elites, the East Coast, West Coast elites, who control the American political and economic life, according to these people, are all interconnected, and they are the deep state. And so they control who runs for president. They control everything. Well, the Turks started this. I mean, the idea of a state within a state is not, as I put on the notes, is not new. But the Turks are the ones who start calling it the deep state. They call it derin devlet. And that's their exact term for it, deep state. And then so when I first started hearing it in America, I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. And so I actually did I haven't been able to find where exactly who the first American politician was who started using the term deep state. Obviously, Fox News is where it's spread, but it seems to have come indirectly from Turkey. So what is the deep state? Let's talk about that a little bit, because it is an interesting. The deep state first emerges in Turkish discourse, not on the right but on the left. And I gave you a little outline there, and it's the incident that first, how did I put it there? Yeah, is the Susurluk scandal of 1996. And Susurluk is a place, a little town, suburb of Istanbul. In 1996, there was a car crash, and the people in the car, 3 of the 4 people in the car, were killed. And that in itself would not be particularly odd, that you had a car crash and 4 people were in it and 3 people died. But the reason it was so strange was because who were the 4 people? Well, first, there was one of the highest ranking members of the Istanbul police, a guy named Bucak Sedat. There was also a member of parliament, a guy named Abdullah Çatlı, who was a Kurdish member of parliament who represented a tribe that had been cooperative with the Turkish government against the PKK. All right. Then the third person was Hüseyin Kocadağ, who is a noted mafiosi. In Turkey, one of the things that had happened along with the opening up of the economy is that you get the rise of organized crime quite dramatically, taking over. I mean, there were nightclubs where, Turkish friends said, you don't want to go there because that's a mafia. Well, they just borrowed the Italian word. That's a mafia thing, organized crime. And so you had a police commissioner, you had a member of parliament, and you had one of Turkey's most ill-reputed mafia bosses. And you then also had Gonca Üs, who was a beauty queen. So you have a mafia boss, a beauty queen, deputy director of the Istanbul police, and a member of parliament. So Turkey at this time had a very free and flamboyant press and television as well, that it all started in the early 90s. And that was, you could not have made up a better story than this. What happened? Because the surviving police chief said, well, I had picked up this mobster. I had him in my car. I had arrested him. And I then saw Abdullah Çatlı and his girlfriend on the street, and I offered them a ride. They got in the backseat of the car, and then we had this crash. This truck crashed into us. And it was this, no one. So it lent itself to being conspiracy. What is going on here? And so the left had already been saying that the Turkish government, at this time it was a conservative government, wasn't the army anymore, but it was conservative. The conservative government was arm in arm with the mafia. And they also then were supporting this Kurdish chieftain down in the southeast, a member of parliament. His tribe had joined the self-defense units that were fighting against the PKK. And so they started talking about the deep state. At that point, they meant the deep state was a right-wing conspiracy. And so that it entered into it, and everyone kept talking about the Susurluk thing. Well, in 2007, when the army threatened Erdoğan about Abdullah Gül, the next year we have a new conspiracy, a new deep state. And this time it was called, there was a secret organization, we were told by the press favorable to the AK party. We were told that there was a secret organization called Ergenekon. And Ergenekon is a mythic word. It's a word, well, it's a word, not a mythic word. A word that refers to a mythic past in Turkey, the origins of the Turks in Central Asia. And it supposedly was this deep state that was of the army and of certain intellectuals, certain newspapers that were opposed to the AK party. So it often was leftist, Cumhuriyet, which was the newspaper that is the party of the Republican People's Party, that it was the, it was in the conspiracy as well. So a whole number of people were put on trial for this, including some of Turkey's leading generals. The chief of staff was put on trial. And so in effect, what the AK party did at this time, it defanged the generals. And the courts have since, the Supreme Court in Turkey, which is luckily has stayed relatively free of political influence, it has overturned some of those convictions. But the net effect was the Security Council that had been set up in the 1960 constitution in Turkey, the one that was supposedly balancing the power between the civilian leadership and the political leadership, was weakened, and that the government, the civilian government, now could appoint the army members of the Security Council. So the Security Council now becomes, where it had been a check, the army had seen it as a check on the civilian government, it was now taken over by the civilian government. And there were Turkish intellectuals that I know who were very sympathetic to that. In other words, they saw this as the end of the possibility of Turkey having a military government, military coups, intervention of the military in Turkish society. So I'll come back to that later, because then the last conspiracy is the more recent coup, attempted coup in when was this recently? I didn't write that down for you. In 2000 and well, let's see if I have it down. Memory is a bad thing. 2017. All right, so I wanted to go over some of the other parties, and I got kind of off. So the AK party then is the main party that has polled. Oh, the last election it was 51%. So it has stayed relatively stable after its initially it got about almost 2/3 of the vote, but since then it's dropped down. The old Republican People's Party, CHP it's called in Turkish, is still there. It gets roughly 30% of the votes, and it still is, its strongholds are the cities, intellectuals, and among the Alevis, the only religious minority in Turkey, and along the coast. So Izmir, for example, has always been a stronghold of the CHP. Unions have been greatly, power has been greatly reduced, so the unions aren't the mainstay of the CHP the way they used to be. And then there is the MHP, which is the Milli Hareket Partisi, the National Movement Party. That's the old fascist. Those are the guys were the gray wolves that were caused the terror in the 1970s. And they are strongly nationalist, fascist. They're anti-Kurdish. And they have, since the AK party doesn't have enough to push through major changes, you need 2/3 to change the constitution. It has often been in alliance with the MHP. That has meant that the earlier attempts by AK party to open up to the Kurds, which I'll talk about in just a minute, have been put on hold or even stopped because the MHP, the National Movement Party, that's anathema to them, that there be any compromise with the Kurds. So that then leaves us with the Kurds. And the Kurds can't have a party that's called a Kurdish party because that's illegal in Turkish, under Turkish constitution. You can't have a party that appeals to a particular religion or national group overtly. So let me go back to, so what about the Adalet ve Kalkınma? Well, the Adalet is not overt. It is subtle. It doesn't say we are a Muslim party, but by putting that a Muslim term in their title, they are in fact saying we are a Muslim party. Well, the Kurds have a similar problem, so they call themselves the People's Party, Halk Demokrat Partisi. So the People's Democratic Party, or how we pronounce it, you take the initials and we say HADEP. So the HADEP party came into being in the 2000, after 2010, and it is, everyone understands it to be the Kurdish party. And the current head of the party has been in prison for the last 2 years because Erdoğan says he has been helping the PKK, that the HADEP party is just a front for the PKK, and they arrested a bunch of HADEP mayors, because what happens is HADEP, once it's formed and everyone in the Kurdish region knows that it's the Kurdish party, it routinely gets the votes of the people in the southeast, and the two large cities down there. The largest is, I didn't write it out, it's Diyarbakir. That is often considered by the Kurds to be their capital of Turkey. So if you look on a map of southeastern Turkey, the largest city down there is Diyarbakir, Diyarbakir. It looks like Diyarbakir, but it's pronounced Diyarbakir. It's that region, the members of parliament are almost always HADEP. So the HADEP gets at least 10 to 11%. So it gets over the 10% barrier. Here lately, it's been getting higher. And what people are saying is that it's well, they can tell because they know where the votes are cast. But a lot of the votes are coming to HADEP from the cities. And while there are Kurds living in the cities, also the theory is that leftists are voting for HADEP. So people who in the past might have voted for some of the more leftist parties, they're voting for HADEP now because it's the most anti-government of the Turkish party, not anti-Turkey, but anti the AK. And so that they got in the last election, they actually had 13% of the vote, so it's higher. So that's also why people think that the question of how many Kurds are there, the fact that the HADEP party gets roughly 10% of the vote, some people say, well, that represents how many Kurds there are. But we know that there are Kurds who vote for AK party. The AK party has the prosperity that was brought in. I mentioned, I talked not last time, but when we talk about water, we talk about the GAP project, the GAP project, the Güneydoğu Anadolu Projesi, the idea, the project to dam the Euphrates and the Tigris and create greater water resources in the southeast. That has led many Kurdish farmers to prosper, and so there is support for the AK party among Kurds. So the fact that the 10% does, people say it's roughly what the Kurdish population is. Other people, as I put on the sheet, say it's as high as 20%. But it's almost, because the Turkish census doesn't ask that question, doesn't ask what language do you speak at home. There's no way of knowing for sure. But anyway, the HADEP party has consistently, and usually they're in alliance with the CHP. So the old, kind of ironic in a way, because the CHP, or the Republican People's Party, Ataturk's party, is very nationalist. For a leftist party, it's very nationalist. It's very much because Ataturk was a nationalist. And so there's some tension between HADEP and the Republican People's Party. And when the government moved against the Kurdish cities 2 years ago, put basically several Turkish cities in lockdown and then moved in with tanks against the PKK people in those cities, the Republican People's Party, well, HADEP condemned it, and some of HADEP's people then were imprisoned. The Republican People's Party supported it because they are ultimately Ataturkist nationalist, and so they have some grounds in common with the AK party. All right, so it's complicated, but because there's only 4, it makes it a little bit easier. And it is, I often make the comparison to the United States when I talk about it with students, is that it's very similar to an American split. I mean, we don't have the equivalent of the Kurds, but it is a right versus left, a very kind of a populist rejection of the intellectuals who have been governing Turkey since the Ataturk revolution, and they're very secular ideas, they're very European looking ideas, are rejected by these people who are not as well educated and or who are becoming educated, but who have these Islamic values. And so it could be seen as a parallel to the American, the red and the blue split in America between the Republicans. As the Republicans get more and more socially conservative, the Republicans of my time were physically conservative, but in your time, they're much more socially conservative. And the Democrats then are seen as the liberal movement. So in Turkey, then the AK Party would be more or less like the Republicans, and the People's Republican Party are more like the Democrats. So it's, remember I said back in the old days that was that way in the 50s, that there was the Democrat and the Republican parties, and they were the opposite. Well, it's still sort of that way in Turkey. And there are from time to time, things that look very similar to the United States. But then I want to get back to it. So go back to what, after the weakening of the military, you then get a series of corruption. Remember I said the judiciary has stayed relatively independent in Turkey. They are appointed by parliament, but the guards, they're not elected, they're appointed by parliament, but you have to have 2/3 to elect them. And so there is a control over it, so that most of them have remained relatively independent. Well, they started to investigate corruption against the AK Party. The AK Party by 2011 had been in for 10 years and had very little checks on them. And so they started the corruption. Turkey, a lot of money was being made. And so money was going to politicians, and including members of Erdogan's family. His son and son-in-law both were indicted on corruption charges. Well, this led to a very interesting split in the right in Turkey, and this I have to bring in the Fethullah Gülen, who's on your list. He started a movement in the 90s called Hizmet. Hizmet is, again, a Turkish pronunciation of an Arabic word, means service. And so it, as I said, just as adalet, because it's from Arabic, it has an Islamic content to it, or context, I should say. Hizmet, because it's from Arabic, also has a kind of, to the hearer in Turkey, it has a kind of Muslim ring to it. And it is, in fact, a Muslim organization. It was a charity organization founded by Fethullah Gülen. And he's a preacher, he's a Sufi, so he's a kind of a mystic. He left Turkey in '99 and lives in a compound in Poconos in Pennsylvania, and Turkey has been asking for his extradition since the attempted coup in 2017. He was he's a very pious man, and he funded schools and he funded charities, and he got a lot of money from various rich industrialists. So his organization was quite efficient and quite effective. And I mentioned that it opened up high schools that did very well on the national exams in Turkey. The students from those high schools did quite well. And it then also started funding Muslim charities in other parts of the world. I know I have a Turkish friend who was going to a market in downtown New York, and one of the open markets, and there was a stall there, and was a African guy there, and he heard my friend's accent in English, and he started speaking in fluent Turkish. And my friend said, well, where did you learn Turkish? And he said, well, I went to a Hizmet school in Senegal, and I learned Turkish. And so, they're all over Central Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia. There are in the Balkans, in the Muslim population, Albania, Macedonia, and Bosnia, there are Hizmet organizations. And so he broke, though. He had been supporting his newspaper. It's called Sabah Morning. It was the most popular newspaper in Turkey, had the largest circulation, very, you know, chatty newspaper, wasn't that serious. But he broke with Erdoğan, that is, Gülen did. He said, this is, you know, you can't have a corrupt system. And so Erdoğan began to say that Gülen was an enemy of the state. Sounds familiar, huh? The press was enemy of the people. And Sabah newspaper was banned by Erdoğan. That was one of the first newspapers that was banned. And so you start to see this increasing Erdoğan becoming more and more prickly about the press, and press starts to self-censor, especially during the Arab Spring. Get to that. Might as well get to it now. I mean, so the investigations into, well, we have two investigations. We have the Ergenekon investigations, which is the state investigating these so-called enemies of the state, army generals, intellectuals. That's the main two categories that are being investigated in prison, and Kurdish, some of the Kurdish groups as well. And then you start to have the investigations into the AK Party by the judiciary. So the state initiates the Attorney General, who is a member of the AK Party. Those investigations are state investigations, but the courts have their own independent ability to investigate. So you begin to have two parallel investigations going on. And then in the middle of all this, you have Arab Spring. And Arab Spring, which I'll talk about in another lecture, gives an opportunity for Erdoğan to kind of move to the forefront in the Middle East. And this is something he had been pushing for. As Europe turned its back on Turkey, the AK Party begins to see itself as reviving the Ottoman Empire. And so this has been called by Turkish leftists neo-Ottomanism, the idea that the Turkish state is going to revive its cultural soft power, some people call it the soft power of the state, that Turkey will use economic development funds and cultural and educational to spread this idea of Turkey being a leader in the Sunni world, and in particular in the regions that were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. So that would be the Arab countries, but also then in the Balkans, especially in Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, and northern Macedonia, where there are large Muslim populations. And so, for example, in those countries, Turkey, you go visit the old cities of in those countries, and Bulgaria as well, and you'll see these massive building projects not to rebuild, but to refurbish, to restore a lot of the old Ottoman mosques and other buildings, bridges and things that were built by the Ottomans are under repair, and always will have a big sign saying this is paid for by the Turkish government. So the Turkish government then is trying to show these people that we're returning, that we have a proud cultural past, and that was what Erdoğan seems to be using as a way of making up for the fact that Europe was closing it. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the Turks were producing consumer goods that were going largely to these areas, to the Balkans, to the Arab countries, to Central Asia. And Central Asia was another area where this policy of neo-Ottomanism was being extended. Even though the Ottomans were never there, they were Turkish-speaking people, and they're Sunnis. And so Erdoğan is reaching out to those countries as well. And there's also the same places that the Gülen organization. So go back to the Arabs, is that in 2010, Gaza, there had been trouble with the Palestinians in attacking Israel, and Israel had put an embargo on Gaza. Nothing was coming in, and so Muslim charity organizations in Turkey organized what they said was going to be a shipment of goods that would run the blockade, the Israeli blockade, and bring in needed supplies, cement, food, medicines, to the Gaza Strip. And this was a very popular movement in Turkey. They had, telethons on TV, and people were, phoning in money, and they raised a lot of millions and billions of dollars. And they set off then with these ships, and one of them was called the Mavi Marmara, which means the blue Marmara, which is the sea there by Istanbul. Mavi Marmara, and why it was famous is the Israelis boarded it by force, and 11 people were killed by the Israeli army. And that became then, Turkey broke relations with Israel, although Turkey had been very, especially the militaries, had been very close with each other. These Turkish, Israel surrounded by, hostile countries, well, Jordan now and Egypt, but it's, in order for their air force to train, they don't really have a lot of space. And so what Turkey did is it allowed Israeli jets to train over to Turkey. And that was closed off. The Israelis had invested in casinos in Turkey. They're very popular with Israeli tourists. Those were closed off. So there was a real drop off all of a sudden of Turkey's connection to Israel. And at the same time, then when the Arab Spring happened, Turkey put itself forward as the protector of the people who were rioting in the Arab countries, because many of them were Islamic. In Egypt, it was the Islamic Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood. And Turkey then saw itself, or Erdogan saw Turkey as a protector of these people. And the Turkish media, Turkish government was very much in favor of the Arab Spring. And the Erdogan, for example, was the first foreign leader to call for Hafez al-Assad to step down from the presidency of Syria. So that then plays into this new role that Turkey is going to have, and I'll talk more about that about the Syrian civil war, because what Turkey does is that it opens the door to jihadists to come into Syria, go into Syria through Turkey, and basically lets anybody through that who wants to, and so that exacerbates it. Also then in this period, the Arab Spring, you have the beginning of the first popular demonstrations against the government. And the most famous of these is what happened in 2013, which is called the Gezi Park demonstrations. The Gezi Park is a very small park in Istanbul. Istanbul doesn't have many parks because it was an urban center that then grew up along the Bosphorus. And all along the Bosphorus, there were areas of private ownership owned by members of the old Ottoman royal family that were basically walled in gardens of, well, not gardens, of forest, walled in forest. And they were the green space in Istanbul. But after the army took over in 80, a lot of that land was confiscated, and some of it was illegally built on. But the whole Bosphorus then became urban development. There are very few who go up the famous Bosphorus ferry to go from Istanbul north to the Black Sea. It used to be you would see about half of your journey, you wouldn't be looking out on either one side or the other of the Bosphorus, and there would be green, foresting. That's almost all gone now. There are housing developments everywhere. And so the amount of public space is very small. And the Gezi Park, which is right in the heart of the commercial center of Istanbul, area called Taksim Square, is a small park. I was trying to calculate it in my head. It's if you think of the field that we have here at Wesleyan, the football and baseball field, it's about half that in width and twice in length. So it's about the same size as our football field, baseball field. So the field below Foss Hill, before you get to College Row, that field I'm talking about, that it's about the same, about roughly the same space as Gezi Park. It's just that Gezi Park is longer and narrower. So it's not a big park, but it's near this main commercial square, Taksim Square. And the government announced plans to build a big mosque. That area was formerly mostly Christian, so there aren't any major, it's the only part of Istanbul that does not have a major mosque. So the government was going to build on that square, which was a main municipal square. And of course, Ataturk had used it, and there's a statue there of Ataturk and his army, victorious army. And across from it, across from the square, there had been the Ataturk Cultural Center, which its government, the AK government, just demolished it. They were going to build. They said they were going to restore military barracks and make it into a shopping mall. Although it wasn't. I mean, they were going to recreate it. It was the plans were a monstrosity, and they were going to take up the park. And so you have all these different student groups and then leftist groups occupy the park. So it's sort of like Occupy Wall Street. They had the same. They took their cue from Occupy Wall Street movement, and they occupied Gezi Park, and it turned into a major demonstrations. It went on for a long time, and just like in the Occupy Wall Street, eventually the troops moved in with tear gas and arrested everybody. But that led to the first real sense in Turkey that this government was going more toward authoritarianism. It was, do I have the date when? Oh, in 2017, it was, I said the coup was 2017. The coup was 2018. Take it back. 2017, the attempted coup. 2017, I'll come back to it. Totally confused. 2017, the constitution was changed. Remember, they have to have 2/3. Well, the AK party was able to get the MHP. At that time, the MHP and the AK together had 2/3. And they changed the constitution to make the president the head of state and not only the head of state, but the head of government. And so they reversed it. The prime minister now is a minor figure, and the president is the main figure. And that meant that he could have a longer term. He was elected independently of the parliamentary elections. And this same thing happened in Israel earlier, that the prime minister became more or less a token, and the president then is, I take it back. It didn't change in Israel. The prime minister could be elected. That was the difference. All right. So in Turkey now, the president then is as strong as the American president, and they in fact copied a lot of the strengthening of the office of the president after the American Constitution. So Erdoğan then is got much more power than he built a huge palace, this horrible palace in Ankara. Presidential palace now, and presidential guard. They have to have special uniforms and all this whole kind of thing. The pomp of being a president, and at the same time, then there was more and more restrictions on the freedom of the press. All right, so this then leads, and then with Arab Spring, I'll come back to Arab Spring another lecture. But in Turkey, what it meant is you begin to have terrorists from the Arab Jihadi movement attacking targets in Turkey. First, it was tourists, just like they did in Egypt, but then there were other attacks as well. This led the government to crack down on the Kurds. They said the Kurds were partially responsible because the Kurdish resistance in Syria, with the help of the Americans, had taken over a large section of northeastern Syria, which is on the Turkish border. And that created tension in Turkey with the PKK, and so, as I said, there were occupations of several Kurdish cities by the army, total lockdown. Nobody was allowed in or out, and then there was house-to-house fighting in some of them, which was 3 years ago, and so that tension was there. And then, in the midst of all this, you have in 2018. You have in the summer of 2018 an attempt by some military officers to overthrow the government. Now, when the tanks started rolling into Istanbul, they took over the television, the national television station, but Turkey had private stations, so it wasn't as effective, say, in 1960 or 1980 when there was just one television station. And in fact, Turk CNN, the CNN version in Turkey, it remained on the air and was reporting the army coup. They missed, planes bombed the parliament. They missed Erdoğan. He was out of town. He escaped. And it turned out the people generally in Istanbul rallied against the army. You had all these people demonstrating, jumping on tanks, things like that. And the coup fizzled, partly because it wasn't the whole army command. Remember, the army command had been defanged, basically, already by Erdoğan. And he then said that this was a conspiracy, as I have it on your list. He calls it the the Fethullahi terör örgütüsü, the Fethullah Gulen terrorist organization. So you'll see that in Turkish press all the time, FETÖ, F-E-T-O, F-E-T-O. And that's what he says. So another deep state conspiracy theory. Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested. Banks that were associated with the Gulen organization were confiscated. I had a book that was under contract to be published. It was a translation of a book I'd already published in English, had been translated into Turkish, and it was going to come out that summer. It turned out the press that was going to publish it was owned by the Gülenist, and so that press was quashed, and the book was, the contract was torn up, and but then another, actually, ironically, press favorable to the AK Party picked up on the book, and so the book now has come out in Turkish translation. But there was a big crackdown, and again, it was aimed largely at the army and at the school teachers. It is true that the Gülen organization had recruited among school teachers, but it was also seen by many, because some, again, secular people from the Cumhuriyet newspaper were arrested, and that's a very secular, the most secular newspaper in the country, at a Turkish newspaper. And so it was just used as an excuse to get rid of people that the government thought were problematic. But it did show then the fact that the army was broken. The army didn't have unified command. It was individual officers who had attempted the coup. They were all quickly arrested. Some of them fled to Greece and to Germany, and the Turkish government has been asking them to be extradited. The Turkish government at that time said that Fethullah Gulen is the key culprit in that, and that he needs to be extradited from the United States to be tried in Turkey, and that's been a thing that's been going back and forth between Trump and Erdoğan. At times it looks like Trump is about ready to send Gulen back to Turkey, and then other times it falls through. But it has been a very turbulent relationship between Turkey and the United States with these two very volatile presidents. I would argue that Turkish relationship would have been weakened anyway because of Erdoğan's increasing authoritarianism. And he has been often compared, and you'll see him compared to Viktor Orbán in Hungary, and also to Vladimir Putin in Russia, as these new autocrats. And I would say that you need to be careful a little bit about that, because it isn't quite as bleak as that Turkey, well, we'll see how, again, the COVID-19 thing has just been a debacle in Turkey. I don't know if you followed it, but Turkey now has one of the highest numbers of cases. And it's because that Erdoğan, like Trump, was in a state of denial about it ever going to reach Turkey. And so it has been just really bungled. And so I would guess that the fact that Turkey still has elections, probably in with that the story what happened last year in Istanbul elections, but Turkey still has elections. And so there are still parties that oppose the government. So it isn't quite like Russia. There is no party that opposes Putin. It's not allowed to organize. There are people who, like Navalny, who oppose him, but they're not allowed to have the platform, the platform that the Turks have. I mean, Cumhuriyet self-censors. I'll talk more about that when we get home with their Syrian civil war. They've consistently self-censored themselves, reporting on what the government is or not doing in Syria. But it's clear that if you read the editorials that they are not for the government. So there still is the Republican People's Party. And like I said, the optimistic story was last year there was an election in Istanbul for mayor. And Istanbul has always been very important for the AK Party, because that's where Erdoğan started off as mayor of Istanbul. So you're going to say, well, why does Istanbul, which is the intellectual center, why it is also a center of the AK Party? Well, the answer is quite simple. Istanbul has 18 million people living in it now, and most of those people are from former rural areas. There are large working class areas there. Those, if they are Turkish speaking, central from Turkey, not Kurds, I'm trying to say, those are AK supporters. So the AK party did have, although large numbers of people in some of the districts of Istanbul vote consistently for Republican People's Party members of parliament. Overall, if you take the city as a whole, it votes for AK. So districts vote for the more intellectual districts, the upper class districts. Those vote for the Republican Workers' People's Party. So in the election for mayor, which are held independently from the parliamentary elections, in the first round, the Republican People's Party won by, I think it was 50,000 votes out of millions cast. And so the government said, no, that wasn't a fair election. There's a lot of, absentee ballot. It sounds familiar, huh? Absentee ballot tampering, and we need to have a new election. So they had a new election, and that just galvanized people. All of the, remember the multiple parties in Turkey, and they all had people, especially in Istanbul, you might imagine, the Greens were relatively strong. The Green Party said, no, we're not going to, our candidate's going to, if you wanted to vote for the Green candidate, vote for the Republican People's candidate. And so he won by a landslide. I think he won 53% of the vote, which in Turkey is a landslide. It was a clear victory for the Republican People's Party. So his name is, I can have it on the list for you. His name is Ekrem İmamoğlu. He's young and very photogenic, very dynamic, but he's a traditional Muslim. And that is an interesting kind of turn, although his wife doesn't wear the headscarf, unlike Erdogan's wife, who wears a very elaborate headscarf. Imamoglu's wife doesn't wear the headscarf, but Imamoglu goes to mosque on a regular basis. And he doesn't drink alcohol. And so you have this kind of almost, you can kind of see it, the Democrats, well, how do we appeal to the working class, white working class, that's, so with the Republican People's Party, you're saying, how do we appeal to those people who used to be for us because they were labor unions? How do we get them to vote for us again? And part of their problem was that their continuing problem is that their head, and that's a guy named Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, is an Alevi. And that is, in Turkey, is as significant as was Obama as the Democratic candidate for president, because there are no racial minorities in Turkey. So there are Kurds, and then there are Alevis. And the Kurds have a very complicated relation with the Turks, but the Alevis for Sunnis are considered heretics. They're not considered real Muslims. And so to have as their, and I actually heard people in Turkey I forget which election it was, but back around 2010 when Kılıçdaroğlu became the head of the Republican People's Party, people I know who are well-educated people who would have normally voted for the Republican People's Party said they weren't going to vote for him because he was an Alevi. And so that kind of discrimination still exists in Turkey toward the Alevi. So they felt they needed someone who was more Islamic. So they picked Imamoglu. And he has done very well. And so Kılıçdaroğlu is still the head of the CHP, but it's not clear how much longer. So there is some hope for Turkey. As I said, some people are saying this economic problems that they're going through, that they were going through before the coming of the coronavirus, but now with the coronavirus, that Turkey may be one of these countries that is shaken up. My point is that it still has, although the army is out of the picture, the army, I think, will never ever again be a force in Turkish politics, and that probably is a good thing. But that it still has enough of a free press and enough of a tradition of political parties that I don't think it will go down the road of Russia, say. And I do expect that because of its infrastructure and because of its education levels and because of its natural resources, that it will come out on the other side in better shape than it has been. So I would say of all the countries in the Middle East, the only one that I have any optimism about is Turkey. The rest of them, I'll talk about Iran in the next lecture. But I don't have much optimism for Iran I definitely don't have any optimism for most of the Arab states. But Turkey looks like it will retain its position as an industrialized country, and then I guess that's a good thing. It also then has had a very active protest movement, and I would recommend that you go on YouTube. I should have written this down for you. It just came to me now. There was a movement back in January in Turkey of YouTube called Susamam. I'll spell that for you. So it's Susamam. Susamam. Go to YouTube and type that in. They made these wonderful number of Turkish musicians put together this kind of almost a rap piece on social justice in Turkey. It's beautiful, well done, and it sparked a whole on YouTube. If you type in that, you'll see there's all these other musical protests that have been put up on YouTube. So there is a much more active voice of opposition in Turkey than there is, say, in Russia. And so I'm relatively optimistic about that. So Susamam, which means I cannot be silent. It is impossible for me to be silent. So please go look at that. I think you'll enjoy it. And the last thing I'd like to say, for those of you on Thursday, will be the first night of Ramadan. So if you are observing Ramadan, Ramadan Mubarak. And if you're a Turk, I say Ramazanınız kutlu olsun. May you have a happy Ramadan. And for the rest of you, and those also celebrating Ramadan, I will see you soon. So bye.